we're now on. So
Okay.
this will be a. They're not going to cover my voice, but I want to just ask some questions, and we're going to try to use just the person being interviewed. Let's go ahead and go. Boy, we're recording. Don Williams. I just want to ask you if you would first, if you would just tell again, I'm Don Williams, and this is. But tell us a little bit about where and when you began your full-time youth ministry, and a little bit about what that was about.
All right. Youth ministry in Churches of Christ. To be honest, Gary, I'm not sure when it began. That'll sound funny to you. There are several men in the late 1940s, Wyatt Sawyer and Holland Boring Jr. and some of those people who said they were in youth ministry. And by the way, we don't really care who's first, but actually when the present day order of youth ministers began was in 1965. I had been born here in Cyril, Oklahoma, grew up here in this little congregation, went to Abilene Christian, and I would go out and preach, in different places. Well, I came to Fletcher, Oklahoma every weekend to preach, and it bothered me that teenagers sat on the back row and didn't, pass notes and looked at pictures and everything like that. So I just decided I'm going to preach one sermon per month just for teenagers. And I still remember the first one I preached on Young People Were Proud of You. But I told the kids, if I do that, you can't sit on the back row. You have to sit up close to the front and participate with the congregation. So they did, and we doubled our number of teenagers, and they had a greater interest. And from that point, a lot of little congregations around in this area, they didn't have any youth rallies or anything like that, and so we were able to start some of those just on a Saturday, for an hour or two, have a program for them, that kind of thing. So then, of course, I went to Abilene Christian, and there wasn't any such thing as a youth ministry program there. You just majored in Bible or the practical field of Bible. After I worked in Oklahoma City with the Northwest Church there as an associate minister from 1960 to 63, and then at the Westbury Church in Fort Worth from 63 to 65. And at that point, I got a call from the Broadway Church in Lubbock, Texas, wanting a youth minister. And no one had ever heard of that disease before. That was a different ballgame, So I said, I can't do that. I've never done it before. Now, one reason they called me is because I was speaking at quite a few youth rallies in different congregations, and we decided in about 63 or 64 to do 2 long play records for teenagers. And so a Christian Publishing Company put out those, and all of a sudden people got pretty excited about anything for teenagers, So at that point, they called me from Lubbock, and I said, I can't do that. In the meantime, Joe Barnett was preaching at the Central Church in Amarillo, Texas, and he saw the need for youth ministry, and he invited Dan Warden to be the youth minister at the Central Church. And so therefore, in this modern progression of youth ministers, Dan was the first one. Now, if I would have accepted Broadway's invitation at first, well, I would have been ahead of Dan, but that doesn't matter, really. So then Broadway looked at several other men, and they couldn't work it out, and so they came back at me in September of 1965, and I moved to the Broadway Church in Lubbock as their full-time youth minister. Of course, they already had 300 teenagers in that program from the 7th through the 12th grade, so that was a pretty good start for a youth program in a congregation, 300. But really, that's kind of how I got started in this program. Yeah.
Great. I want to ask you, Don. We're doing a little experimenting here with the. I don't know with this hum. I can barely hear it.
Yeah.
Probably isn't going to be an issue, but I may pull this up a little closer and have you speak a little.
Okay.
So it won't be a stress on your voice.
Okay, I'm fine.
And but I think we're good.
Okay. All right.
Zoom it out just a little bit.
You tell me if I'm doing anything.
You're doing great. Doing great. Okay, yeah.
It doesn't bother me. If it's close, it doesn't bother me at all.
If it doesn't, that may be a good thing. Let's do this then. I would rather have it a little close.
You put it wherever it suits you. I don't care.
And zoom it out a little bit. That'll help us with that.
Now that gets the refrigerator.
Yeah.
The refrigerator stuff on top.
You want me to move it, Susan?
Actually, if there you go. If you just do it this way, is that okay?
Yeah. They actually prefer that they don't have
A whole picture behind them.
So let's do that.
Okay.
You want me to move?
No, I don't think so. I think it's okay. You know, is that okay about just the only thing I'm looking at is the stuff on top of the refrigerator?
I think that's okay. We're gonna, and again, we'll edit some of this. Don, you talked some about your start in
Right.
youth ministry and some of the players there. Could you track for us the churches? You mentioned you started with, I guess, with the Northwest Church first.
Right.
Could you tell us just kind of place by place where you were, and maybe some people you encountered? Significant.
That might help a little bit, Gary, because I began, actually, it was the 25th and Geraldine Church in Oklahoma City, but now the Northwest Church. And I was the associate minister. But when I got there, I was interested in young people. There wasn't any such thing as a youth minister. I led singing and did all of those kind of things. But I taught a class of young people. And then, interestingly enough, and I'll come back to the churches in a minute, what really helped as much as anything to start youth ministry, Joseph Jones, who was then one of the Bible teachers at Oklahoma Christian, called me one day and wanted me to teach a class at the lectureship out there on how to teach young people. And I said, Joe, I can't do that. He said, of course you can. You can do it. Well, when we got the lectureship program, I was amazed how great I was, because it talked about the dynamic, this and that, and I thought, what in the world, But when we walked in to that class out there, there were people galore. And let me give a little background to that. It might help. What happened in the 50s, the main staff of a congregation would be the pulpit minister, and if they had a second man, it would be an educational director. In the 50s, educational directors were everywhere. And then all of a sudden, congregations woke up to the fact that they could find someone in the congregation who was a school, someone from the school or whatever, to work with the education program, but they didn't have anyone to work with young people. So all of a sudden, in 61, when I taught that session at the lectureship, the room couldn't hold the people, because right then people were wondering, what are we going to do with young people? The word everywhere was that we were losing at least half of our young people. And where they thought we were losing 50%, I thought we were losing 70 to 80% of our young people within 5 years out of high school at least. So that promoted people everywhere to call me and want me to come to their congregation and teach classes on how to teach teenagers. Now, I didn't feel like I knew any of those answers, but that's what kind of got the ball rolling more than anything else in Churches of Christ at that point. After I was at 25th and Geraldine, or Northwest, for 3 years, I wanted to finish my master's degree, and I moved to Fort Worth, where Abilene Christian had an extension program, so I could finish that. So I was at the Westbury Church for 2 years as an associate minister. But then I moved to the Broadway Church in Lubbock, which then was the second biggest Church of Christ in the world. But that congregation, interestingly enough, with no youth minister, had already built a youth activity center. No other congregation had ever done that. And they were far-reaching enough to have built a kind of a mini gymnasium in their main building, even before they had the youth activity center. So no one had hardly done that in the brotherhood. Some people didn't like it, some people thought it was bad, but still, that was the situation. So the Broadway Church at that point, being second only to Madison, Tennessee in size, was so far-reaching. They had started to help start the Lubbock Christian College. They had helped start the Bible chair there for Texas Tech students and Lubbock Christian students. They had helped start the children's home and helped start this youth push at the same time. And they had some men there at Broadway who did kind of half-time, part-time work in youth ministry. But I was actually their first full-time youth minister. And it was there, eventually, after Joe Barnett came there to be the pulpit minister, that Joe said one day, I mean, here was Joe, who had been in the first two congregations to have youth ministers. And he said, Don, why don't we have a youth minister seminar? Well, I was a youth minister, but I'd never thought of that before. And so I can't even tell you what year, probably around 68, somewhere along there, 67, 68. We had the first youth minister seminar ever in the history that I knew of in Churches of Christ. And I think there were probably 35 there, some full-time, some part-time men by that time. But it was a first for Churches of Christ. And then it grew and grew and grew. And since that time, as you know, there have been ones branch off of that and have different programs, you know, to help youth ministers. But we realized at that point that there was a need to help evangelize youth ministry around the situation. So we just decided there had to be some new things done. So one of the things we did also is we decided that we needed to bring young men in to work, say, during the summer or during part of the school year to work with me. And so I had, as far as I know, the first helper, whatever you want to call him at that point. And, just to train these young men. We were doing everything we could to try to establish youth ministry. And I thought, we have to get the Christian colleges involved in this thing. So I went to the Bible department head at Abilene Christian and at Harding and at Lipscomb and everywhere else, and they wouldn't give me the time of day. They were not interested at all. Well, when about 5 years later they woke up and saw what was happening in youth ministry, then they were calling me and saying, could you come help us have part of a degree plan in youth ministry? We're always a little slow in the Church of Christ, But we tried to do a number of things, at the Broadway Church to encourage that. So I worked there from 1965 to 71 before I went to Pepperdine University for 21 years and then to Abilene Christian for 10 years and taught as an adjunct Bible faculty member at both places there. In fact, I taught 23 years in the Bible departments of the two colleges. But programs by that time were just moving every direction. There were new youth ministers. There were new youth ministry programs, that kind of thing. And things like retreats and rallies and all of that, you couldn't count the number of them hardly that were going on. And so when I moved to California, there were several years, besides teaching in the Bible department, I was speaking over 400 times a year. And so I was speaking over an average of once a day because I would go off, as you know, on the weekend and speak 4 times or 5 times. And I was speaking during the week. I was speaking at schools. Even high schools got interested in this kind of situation. In Lubbock, Texas, I had invitations more than I could count just to come and speak to assemblies and to homerooms, to different classes like that. And that kind of thing took off so much. And then even high schools began to call to do baccalaureates and commencements and that kind of thing. So there was never a lack of work to do. By the way, later you can edit this thing any way you want.
Great. Great.
So just take what you want and leave the other part out.
Okay. You mentioned, Don, some alluded to this. What drew you to youth ministry?
Right.
Would you is there anything that maybe you touched on it? Is there anything that you'd want to speak to in terms of more direct? What draw you there?
Okay. Well, I think number one, I saw how many young people we were losing, as I mentioned. And second of all, I felt like they were almost a second-class citizen. You know, that the church was for adults. It wasn't for youth. And I thought, their soul's just as valuable as anyone else's, and we can't lose these kids in this way. Now, it's interesting how that developed, though. As you know, one of the problems was we didn't have anything in Churches of Christ. And when you become a youth minister and you decide to develop a program, there is no program. You have to decide what you're going to do, see. So I decided when I went to Lubbock, I'll just go visit some of the denominational youth ministers and ask them how their program runs or what they do, you know. In fact, in Lubbock, you had the second biggest Southern Baptist church in the world, and you had the second biggest Church of Christ in the world, and you had the fourth biggest Methodist church in the world, all on the same street within 10 blocks of each other. So I go to visit them. I go to visit their youth ministers, and I found out immediately that their programs had already developed into almost a recreational entertainment type of program. And as long as I live, I'll never forget one of the youth ministers of one of those groups. I looked at the program he handed me, and it was all the ball teams and all of that kind of thing. And I asked him the question, where is your Bible study? And he was honest enough to say, Don, several years ago we got away from that, and we've never learned how to get back. Boy, that was crucial to me. And I said to me, as long as I live and train youth ministers, we're going to do our best to never leave that Bible teaching. And I've just felt like that was such a key issue for years and years. And I can honestly say that the first guys who were in the youth ministry in Churches of Christ, that was such a crucial issue for them. If it wouldn't have been, I think we would have lost the program to begin with. But it was a crucial issue in that.
Well, I can attest that you did emphasize that strongly and embedded it. And I appreciate that. I really do. Tell us, and you hit some on this, Don, but tell us some of what it was like to work in youth ministry at that time when you did get going. I know you just mentioned in Lubbock, there was no pre-packaged program. You did it, or you had to find out some way. But so you go to some place, in this case, Lubbock at Broadway. You're setting it up. What was it like once you go and you visit some of the people in town? But what kind of challenges? What were the teenagers like at that time as opposed to today?
All right. Well, let's talk about it from several different directions. First of all was getting the church to accept youth ministry everywhere, literally. Because, as I said, they had pulpit ministers and they had educational directors.
Can I interrupt for just a second? One of the things I made a mistake in doing at the outset. Let me tell you, since we are going to be editing my voice, they're not going to be hearing my questions. So what if you can, as if you're just making a statement, if you'll kind of restate the statement, that'll be helpful.
Okay.
So just in terms of how you got things started when you started at Lubbock or wherever.
Okay. Starting out was one of the difficult things. And I think very few youth ministers today have any concept what it was like. Because there were no youth ministers in Churches of Christ. So what do you do? And then immediately when it started, we began to be written up in brotherhood publications everywhere, man. Where is it in Scripture about youth ministry, you know? And so the biggest battle for literally for the first few years was winning the right to be a youth minister. I'm talking about from Scripture and everything. We had to write articles. We had to go sit down with congregations, with elderships, with everything to try to win the right. Now, that to a new youth minister today, that doesn't mean anything, you know. But that was a really, really tough part of it. And I'd say I'd say, well, it's in the same scripture as pulpit ministers, or it's in the same scripture, but still, we had to win it. Now, that wasn't the hardest part, though. I knew we had to establish it biblically, but I also knew, see, what a lot of people were worried about was whether these youth ministers were going to get involved with these high school kids in a moral way or immoral way or whatever else, you know. And I knew that if a youth minister had an affair with a teenage girl, it would completely destroy the youth ministry program. I figured it would ruin it for 30 years at least. And I as vividly as everything, I can remember the first one that we knew about. He was a very, very well-known youth minister and had an affair with a high school girl and got her pregnant. And when we got over that hurdle right there, I knew that we had gotten to the point where youth ministry could progress. So it was a biblical issue, but it was also a fear that the youth ministers were not going to be the kind of people they should be in those situations. I know this sounds funny to a lot of people listening to this and to new youth ministers, you know, but we had to win. We had to win all of those battles, and then of course at the start, Gary, it attracted. All new programs attract some weird birds. I don't care what program it is, you know. And so all of a sudden, here comes some guys, and you think, where did they come from? Man alive, you know, just blew us away, you know. And so, it was really hard. I mean, of course, you ought to probably laugh at this, but it's kind of like speaking at a single seminar. You have some great ones there, and then there you have a few, and you think, where in the world did these come from? You know, and we felt that way about a lot of new guys. So the guys who were really solid, boy, they had a task, because when they spoke at the youth minister seminar or any program, they had to tell how the cow ate the cabbage, because they couldn't let some weird guys ruin the possibility of what this was going to do in our brotherhood, you know. So the first guys they just did a fantastic job, really. And there were several that were just really, really solid, and some of them were even a little older. I know by mentioning any of these, it's not wise, because I'm going to leave out some, you know, but Ben Zickafus, who was at Abilene Christian at that point, teaching in the phys ed department, he was really a youth minister at the college church then, University Church now. And you had Dwayne Eggleston up in Kansas, who was a little bit older, you know, that kind of thing. And then of course the guys who began in the thing, like old Bill Jackson and Tim Lewis and Wally Wilkerson and John Paul Blankenship and you know, Bobby Heiss, as you mentioned. They were fun guys. They knew how to play with kids, but they were solid, and they knew what had to be done, you know, to make the program go. So those first steps were really, really difficult things. I was written up more times than I can count, and that was tough, because I wanted to fire back at every one of those, but. Some of the preachers I worked with, even the Christian college presidents I worked with, encouraged me not to, you know, fire back at them, because all some people do is just want to write up the brotherhood, you know, that kind of thing. So, and by the way, it's interesting what's happened with this thing, because the youth ministry began, this current program began in 1965, first youth ministers. And about 3 years ago, I had a list of youth ministers on my computer at Abilene Christian. And I had listed over 1,100 full-time youth ministers. This was not youth and education or youth and involvement. This was full-time youth ministers. So from 1965 until, you know, around 2000, that's how fast this program progressed. I didn't dream it could do that. And the reason I didn't dream it could do that wasn't because I didn't believe in the church. It was the fact that I thought there would become a saturation point where a congregation of 150 people just couldn't economically have a pulpit minister and a youth minister. But I'm literally staggered right now at the number of congregations who are 200 in number, and you just think they're not going to have the money, and they have a full-time youth minister. I think the reason is they just see such a drastic need for young people in this culture and in this world right now. And so they're just determined to make the thing go some way. Don't ask me where I started on this thing, but that's kind of a beginning.
That intrigues me when you say that, because it's grown so much, and you said a while ago that it draws a lot of different types of people. Some that are solid, some that feel,
right.
But then some that may not be.
Right.
That was a pretty heavy responsibility for someone like you, who was there at the start, to feel like we've got to. If this warrants our time and our attention,
right.
we've got to make sure we do this right.
That's right.
Do you feel good about where it's gone?
Not altogether. Let me get to that in just a minute. Let me turn it around first.
And I have some questions along those lines.
And that is, in relation to where it's gone, when you first did a youth minister seminar or a lecture to adults, you had to spend half of your time telling them what not to do, what guy not to get. And see, when I started, there was no youth ministers list. Even elders didn't even know really. I'm kind, but they didn't know what they wanted. They just wanted somebody to help with their young people. And even when I went to Lubbock, they said, now Don, in fact, Bonoski, who was the pulpit minister there, said, now Don, our elders don't really know what they need. And if you can't do the job, they'll get somebody else. But they don't know right now what to do, see. And so some of the elders there, one of them wanted me to keep his kid out of jail. One of them wanted me to, his kid was having, their own personal kids were having problems. He wanted me to do this. They didn't really know what they wanted. So one of the first things that was necessary was to do a job description. And every time you spoke to a group, you had to pass that thing out and say what to do and what not to do. And then, by the way, we spent a staggering amount of time going to congregations by themselves who were wanting a youth minister and just sitting down with the elders and spending 3 hours, 4 hours, saying what to do, what not to do. And by the way, it put us on the spot because we weren't the rulers and we weren't the ones who were supposed to decide, but because no one knew anything about the game, we just kind of had to develop our philosophy in that thing. Everything we did, from the ground, we just had to work. When we wanted to start a Timothy and Dorcas club in Lubbock for the 4th through the 8th grade, someone said, "What kind of material will we use?" There wasn't any material. Any program you had, you wrote your own material. I wrote our Bible class material. I did things that we had never done in Churches of Christ because I thought that was the best thing. And it's not that we thought we knew the answers. We just had to do our best to develop a program for this. So that made it real tough. But back to the question of how I feel about how things have progressed. I felt like it went really healthy at the first because the youth ministers, number one, had to have a great camaraderie. We felt very close. We spent time on the phone with each other. If we didn't know the answer to something, we just called them and said, "What have you done?" or "What'll work?" or "What won't work?" That kind of thing. So I think all of us felt so inadequate. We just worked our heads off at that thing. But then, as time goes, you get new generations of youth ministers who they didn't have to do all of that, and they just kind of want in on the coattail of a situation. And because the culture of today is a different ball game as far as entertainment, as far as media, as far as morality, as far as a lot of things, I think it's been really tough for a lot of the youth ministers to still keep their focus on Bible, what their job really is. Mothers and daddies have wanted the youth minister to take their place, which God doesn't establish, and a lot of youth ministers have wanted to do that. And so it's hard for any new generation of youth ministers to keep their eye on the Lord in these situations, you know. The reason I say that also is because the youth ministers at the start, I think they had a good focus on the difference in doctrine and methodology. Those are totally two different ball games. Just because you change your methodology doesn't mean you change your biblical stance. And the guys were really strong on the biblical stance at the start. But they realized we were going to have to change our methodology of how we did a lot of things. But that doesn't mean they changed doctrine. I've watched a lot of new youth ministers, and especially in the last 15 years, who are not as interested in doctrine. They're just interested in how could we entertain the kids, how could we go do things with them and that kind of thing. And I was at a seminar some time ago, and one of the youth ministers, it was a panel of elders. Youth minister stood up and said, "When you elders are going to start letting us do what we want to do?" Ooh, man, I mean, the older ones in the group, just the fire almost shot out of their eyes, you know. And what I mean by that is, there are a lot of young men who think they know more than elders about handling a congregation. Not wise young men. You know, they don't know that elders are to feed the flock and this kind of thing. And so, one youth minister in a program like this, he was really frustrated because he wanted this particular congregation to hire him in spite of the fact that he believed that instrumental music was fine in the worship, and the elders wouldn't do it, you know. So a lot of guys, they have come out of this generation over the last 40 years where they want liberty and they want their own way and that kind of thing. So it's really hard for a new youth minister to find his place in all of this.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Don. In fact, I want to revisit some of that here in just a few minutes, more specifically. But you mentioned philosophy, or I don't think you said theology, but doctrine versus methodology. Right. If you define your philosophy of youth ministry when you started.
Good.
And also, would it change today if you had to do it over again?
Right. Well, it was hard for me at first because the church.
If you could state that, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My fault.
No, it's my fault. I forgot. My philosophy of youth ministry, it was very difficult to establish that at first because the church had only looked at three areas, like with worship or the church program or anything. They had only looked at what they called evangelism, edification, and benevolence. And I honored those, and that was great. But when I started into youth ministry, I say, is that going to be the philosophy? Are we just going to function off those three things? Or are there other things in the Bible we haven't looked at? And all of a sudden, I found out that there was an area that we had not even really spent any time on, hardly, and that was worship. And I thought, well, there's nothing more biblical than worship, you know. And then I had to reevaluate. I had to reevaluate everything I did with the kids in light of who they were and what the Bible was. And so when I came to the Broadway Church in Lubbock, for instance, they had basketball teams. I'd never had a basketball team anywhere. The church at Cyril, Oklahoma didn't have a gymnasium or a basketball team, you know. And so I went to their games. And our high school guys that were in the Y League, their language was awful. Their attitude was rotten, you know. And I thought, I don't think that fits into my philosophy of youth ministry. And I called them all in and stopped the program. And they about had a heart attack. Because we had already made that transference into kind of an entertainment type of world, even if you didn't have a youth minister. And so I said, boys, we're not going to. I said, that doesn't help any part of the program. It doesn't fit any part. So they battled with me. I could still hear old Bill, one of them, coming in one morning. He said, Big Don, let us play basketball. We'll pray before every practice, and we'll pray after every practice. I said, Bill, I'm not asking that. But it's going to have to be a different world. It's going to have to fit. And so I had to decide if we could buy basketballs and things like that, and they could fit into this philosophy. So I told the guys, I said, guys, if it doesn't fit into evangelism, and if it doesn't fit into benevolence in any way, we're not going to have it. Well, we completely even revamped the basketball program where I said, you can't have basketball unless you'll bring guys to church service with you and Bible class and all that. Next Sunday morning, I had 4 new guys in my Bible class. I mean, they had to get a different focus on this thing. Well, we're back on this philosophy thing. So I had to reevaluate every single thing I did, literally, and think, how valuable is it? For instance, we had 13 different high schools represented in that one youth program. We had about 4 high schools, which were the big ones, but we had them all over the place. And I had to decide how much time do I spend out at these high schools. And then we worked with the Children's Home of Lubbock, and I said, how much time do I need to be out here? How is it involved in the philosophy of youth ministry and all this kind of thing? So it was hard because the ones of us who started had to get our philosophy in order before we could ever talk to anyone else about it. But let me just mention one other area of that thing that probably helped me as much as anything. And that was Jim Beavis, who was the educational director at Broadway, was trying to do the same thing with the educational program. What's the philosophy of it? And we sat down and worked at the thing. And so I developed a philosophy of youth ministry in this way. I said, number one, what are the biggest needs of our kids? What are the biggest needs of our kids? Do they need a normal Bible? Do they need a better relationship with mother and dad? Do they need, what are their biggest needs? Number two, what are the goals that we need to set up with those needs for 2004, 2000, whatever, What are the goals we need to set up? Where do we want them a year from now? So that was the second one. And then the third one was, I said, okay, what are taking their needs and their goals, what programs are we going to have in the next year to be where they need to be for God at the end of that time? Now that sounds very, very simple. But what I did is I gave that same sheet to every kid, to every parent, to every elder, and had them bring it back. And then at the bottom I had put down, what does this contribute to your spiritual growth? Well, this kid who wanted a stereo in the Sunday school room, he had to figure out some way that worked into the spiritual life of the kid. But I think that philosophy helped me more than anything else, and I did it every single year. Because what we had done before that time was we took the Lord's Supper to the shut-ins. We had sometimes a Sunday night fellowship, went to 2 youth rallies a year, and went to 1 Christian college or something. That was kind of the youth program. Well, all of a sudden I said, we're going to prioritize this philosophy. And so we're going to take all these needs and we're going to take the ones that they need the most. And that's what's going to become our program. And boy, that was tough. That was tough. But what it caused me to do, by the way, parents didn't know how to handle it and the elders didn't know how to handle it. Because I said, okay, we're not going to just, I said, I could probably take some 5th graders down to help serve the Lord's Supper or something. But we've got to get some programs that motivate and encourage and are at a different level. Well, I know I'm talking too much, so you just have to edit out whatever you don't want in this thing. But, so we even, Gary started a brand new program of education. And that was the most revolutionary thing we did. I thought, what we had always done in education before that with the teenagers was we had 3 areas. We had material, and we had the teacher, and we had the need. Well, we always just chose the teacher first, because we had to have somebody to teach the teenagers. So we chose the teacher. Then we went out to the store and bought some material that looked pretty good. And the last thing we did is figure out whether it met a need or not. Well, we got to transfer that around. So we totally revamped the thing and went by needs first. What do these kids need? Do they need in fact, one of the things we developed for our juniors and seniors was a philosophy of life according to Jesus, to get ready for them to get out of high school, you know. So we chose the need, then we chose the material, then we chose the teacher. And that sounds very elementary, but it's one of the most revolutionary things we ever did. But then, you probably think I'm crazy, but I revamped the whole educational program and by the way, it took 17 classes on Sunday morning just to teach our 7th through 12th grades. We had 3 in each grade except 2 in the 8th grade. But all of a sudden I discovered that we were teaching on such an elementary level. And that we had both Lubbock Christian kids who had Bible every day in their class, and then we had the children's home kids who, a lot of them had never been in Bible school in their life. They didn't know Adam from Romans. It didn't mean anything. And so I decided that we were going to challenge these kids in a new way. And I've tried to get churches to do this everywhere. No one's ever taken it. But anyway, I set up a program where like the first class of the senior class, in order to stay in that class, they had to do a notebook, they had to do a theme, they had to do a research paper if they want to stay in it. They had to memorize 25 passages of scripture. They had to bring 6 visitors. We had a list of stuff if they're going to stay in that class. And then, I did that with challenges all the way across. Well, everybody had a heart attack. We had more heart attacks through this thing you can shake a stick at. But we developed all that thing. And then I gave them a Bible test to figure out where they needed to be. I didn't care whether they were in class with their boyfriend or their girlfriend or whatever else, because our object was to teach them God's Word, And so it was unbelievable what happened. Because once we got kids in different classes by their need and by their level, some of the kids who had never been in Bible class before, their attention span was 6 and 7 seconds. And I had to use 4-year-old material for them. But see, before that, what we had done in Bible classes was we just came in and we taught, and the same 4 people answered every question every Sunday. The others didn't give any trouble, but they just sat there. And they weren't problems. They didn't. All they did sit there for 45 minutes, and So I know I don't need to tell all of this, but what I'm saying is, every avenue of our program, it had to fit back into this philosophy again. How are we going to teach the Bible? And then I had to decide. I was running about 30 programs during a school year, different programs. I had to decide which ones were my priority and put more emphasis on those than any other. And I still believe, as Ira North taught then, that the Bible school, as goes the Bible school, so goes the church. And so I decided that my Bible classes on Sunday morning were one of the most crucial things, because the kids were going to be there then whether they wanted to be or not. Parents are going to bring them then. They may not be there on Sunday night or Wednesday night, but they're going to be there Sunday mornings. So I'd say that is a crucial time. I want those Bible classes to be dynamic beyond anything else. I'd rather have 100 in a class with a dynamic teacher than 7 classes with dead teachers, this kind of thing. And then, because of evangelism, I wanted our mission trips to be dynamic things. And so I chose the programs that fit into those areas that were going to make the strongest program we could have. Now, what happened to other things? What happened to a Sunday night fellowship? I didn't care whether our kids came or not. And that blew everyone's mind, because I'm like the preacher who went down to the train station every day because that's the only thing that went through town. He didn't have to push. And I didn't want to have to push 30 programs at the same time. You couldn't push them to the same degree. So I chose my priority items. And a lot of those other things, if they came, great, they could get some benefit, but I couldn't push all of them at the same time, So I had to set up my philosophy, and then I had to set up the kind of the programming philosophy of what's going to have emphasis in the biblical and the worship and all this kind of thing, and then I had to set up my needs and that kind of thing, and let them fill that out and work from there. Now I may have confused everybody trying to explain this thing, but what I'm saying is, if a youth minister goes into a church and just does the same thing everybody's always done, it can be just as dead as it's ever been, too, And the reason I get frustrated with a lot of youth ministers is a lot of parents are just wanting those youth ministers to take care of them when they don't want to be there. And man, I had to cure that, in those fellowships on Sunday night. The parents, some of them didn't care whether they came back at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock to get the kid. I told them at 9 o'clock I wasn't going to be there anymore. Their kid would be standing out on the corner. We had to get that straightened out, And I didn't let the kids come over to my house all the time. You know what I mean? Some of them would be over there every night of the world and stay. They'd spend the night if they could. You know what I'm saying? So, a lot of ones who are listening to this tape know this stuff better than I do. But you just really have to decide what your priorities are going to be, and you have to make the cuts, and you just have to go from there. And by the way, maybe this is the worst thing I can say at this point, but I didn't really care whether people liked me or not. I wanted the young people to like me, and I wanted the adults to like me because they would listen better. But I wasn't doing things to please people. I was doing things because I believed that was the best thing for the glory of God in those kids' lives. And if you get away from that, you're going to lose it all. Well, I didn't mean to spend an hour working on that.
You're doing great. You're doing great. In the middle of all that, memories. You have tons of them.
Yeah.
Maybe some that you'd like to remember that are really very fond. Maybe some that you'd like to forget.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Share any of those? Some that may stand out more, or maybe some occasions, events, people,
right.
Maybe a trip, whatever.
Oh, the trouble about this, the trouble about remembering events and people is I could go for hours and hours and hours. But I think, to put it kind of in a nutshell, the treasures probably were the youth ministers that I knew, where we had to work our head off to try to figure out what day it was, But the biggest revelation, I think, of my whole youth ministry, Gary, was that it didn't take me too long to find out that I was spending too much time with the kids who were going to make it anyway. Now, I don't know whether that means a lot to a lot of people, but one day we had a kid had a bad accident, and he's going to be in the hospital, and I thought, we need to pray about this kid. We're going to pray around the clock for this kid. Well, I called a couple of my kids and oh yeah, what time do you want me to pray? And then I called old Barry, who was the center on the Lubbock High football team, and he said, pray all night. I mean, he went into heart attack again over praying all night. And what I mean is, I had a tendency to want to spend the time with the kids whose parents were really strong in the Lord, and the parents were going to give them the spiritual direction. And if I would have never been there, they would have made it well, And so it kind of slapped me in the face a few times that I had to. You have your 10 to 20% who they're going to be faithful. They're going to do everything. You don't even have to ask. They just say, when is it? That kind of thing. And you have your bottom 10 or 20% who they come from tough homes, dysfunctional homes. They have problems. You need to give them a lot of time. But really, there was a group in the middle who could have gone either way real easily. And I just realized that I needed to have been spending a lot more time with them, that kind of thing. At the same time, we had 50 of our 300 kids from the Children's Home of Lubbock. And I went out every Monday night and ate with one of the cottages, and I spent a lot of time with those kids and loved them to death. But man, I mean, I think of some heartbreaking situations, you know. In fact, when I think, it's funny, when you deal with young people or you teach in college, you don't remember the people in the middle. You remember the really strong ones, the one who are really strong, and you remember the notorious ones, you know. But I remember when I first went to the children's home, one of the young girls, she was 15, she had just come there that week, but she had already taken the guys out behind the barn to teach them the way of the world more perfectly, you know. And I mean, and you just had notorious things. One, and I can mention Desi's name. She was precious. She came there. She was about 5'11" and a half. I said to her one day, by the way, and a lot of these kids came out of tough homes, so all they knew was to fight or to speak strongly. I walked up and introduced myself to her, asked her what her name was. My name is Desi. I mean, she about knocked me over, you know. She always got about that far from me. I said, Desi, what do you want to be in your life? She said, truck driver. I said, okay. So eventually we went and got her a job at the truck stop, washing windows of the trucks, you know. And she was in hog heaven, you know. But Desi won the, first week, 3 of the boys at the children's home made fun of her. She whipped all 3 of them. She was 195 pounds, and boy, she was not fat. She had shoulders, huge shoulders. She whipped all 3 of them. Boy, she cured that right then. But those kind of people. I was driving through Wichita Falls one day, stopped at a light. All of a sudden, I heard somebody scream, "Big Dog!" Looked when it was Desi. Couldn't believe it, you know. I think every youth minister's had all these kind of memories, you know. But you have, but you know, when I'd go out to the children's home, and about 5 to 6 of them would have a picture of their mother or dad in prison on their mirror up there. Boy, that was tough, you know. And one of them had watched her dad kill her mother, you know. And boy, some of those stories are just so tough. And you know, one of them, even after I left Lubbock, I came back and found out that he'd gotten married and had a little girl, and he had such a problem with anger. He had killed his wife and killed his little girl, and I immediately canceled everything and went to the jail and sat for 2 hours and visited with him, you know. But I tell you, the needs of these kids just overwhelm you when you think back about them and all that. But the blessings, I could talk for 10 hours and not even stop with all the blessings of kids. One girl flew with me to Canada and spoke to the girls up there, and what a powerful message she had. And the mission trips that we had, one of the girls brought, in 4 mission trips, brought 15 people to the Lord with her partner. And this is where we just went cold turkey and knocked on doors and set up Bible studies, you know. And so you have just every kind of situation. If I'd have thought ahead of time about this, there's no telling what stories would have come out, you know. But boy, they're a rich thing. I guess within that came a grieving thing too, though. That was, I guess, I had a tendency to get frustrated because parents didn't do the job they should have done with their kids. You know, I mean, they thought since I was the youth minister that I was supposed to. They thought I was supposed to train their kids, and that the Bible class was supposed to teach the Bible to their kids. And I've used that Deuteronomy passage thousands of times. I said, yeah, there are only 4 times of the day you're supposed to teach your kid the law. You know, when you get up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way. Those are the only times you're supposed to teach your kids the Bible, you know. But I was always conscious of the fact that sometimes I was taking the job of a parent when I shouldn't do that. That I should be doing a better job of training parents to teach the Bible and instruct the kids and teach them morality and that kind of thing, you know.
Don, was that something that that dawned on you later on? Or was that something that early on? There are several people today that hold that view now.
Right.
And it's a more popular, more common.
Right.
But although it's not embraced by most people still. But is that something that you just, within yourself, thought, I'm really not doing what I need to be doing here?
In relation to whether parents were doing their job and what I needed to do, it didn't hit me right at the first because everything was so new. I was just trying to figure out what day it was for a while. But I'd say within 2 years, I became much more conscious. But to be honest, youth ministry still was not in that mode at all back then. I mean, into what we call family ministry or that kind of thing.
Not sure
and yet, I felt like we were taking a responsibility which was not ours. Now, I had just as much awkwardness about it, though. I guess when a lot of the youth ministers tried to get into this area, I talked to several, and I had the feeling that they were trying to get out of a lot of work. you know what I'm saying? So there are both sides to the coin, I know. But to be honest, we didn't know how to get parents into it once we figured out we weren't doing the best job. We didn't know how to. And so we tried some things on that. I can remember doing 4 Sunday night classes before worship service where we had the kids tell what they liked about their parents, and then the parents tell them what they liked about their kids. And the next 2 weeks, the kids told what they didn't like about their parents. And by the time the parents got through with their situation, what they didn't like about the kids were so humbled they didn't know what day it was. But we did a number of things, and then for instance, we had some retreats where the whole family had to come. Had a retreat where we did a communication type of retreat, and that meant that we discussed some inter-family situations with their families. But we had to learn those things, and make them up. So we did that. There were a number of things that we did to try to bring. Oh, and we did at least one Sunday night fellowship a month where a kid couldn't come unless the parents came. And by the way, the whole family came, and they all had to participate. Parents couldn't sit over here and the kids do this, so we tried to do a lot of those things back then. We didn't call it family ministry, but we were trying to get mothers and daddies with those kids. But boy, it was needed. It was needed back then.
Thank you. What we're going to do here, we're at a point where we're going to replace the tape and have a few more questions. Good.
Susan, you didn't know I was going to talk for 3 hours, did you?